She scoffed as he took his seat beside her, her eyes filled with silent judgment. "People like him don't belong in first class," she whispered loudly enough for others to hear, flashing a smug smile. She saw the uniform but ignored what it stood for. Just a man in her eyes, not worth an ounce of respect. But what she didn't know was that the stranger sitting quietly next to her was about to be the name on every news channel the very next day. And when she saw why, she broke down in tears, too late to take it back. Have you ever misjudged someone and wished you hadn't? Share in the comments. Before we continue, let us know, where are you watching from? Her name was Victoria Langley, a woman who believed the world owed her something. She was the picture of privilege, polished, poised, and proud. Dressed in designer clothes, clutching a luxury handbag, she walked through life like it was her personal runway. Victoria wasn't just wealthy. She was entitled. She thought money made her better than others, and she made sure people knew it. To her, respect wasn't something you gave freely. It was something people had to earn, preferably with status or a last name that carried weight. Then there was Marcus Johnson, the man she couldn't be bothered to notice beyond his uniform. He sat quietly, wearing it with pride, not as a symbol of authority, but of service. A black soldier with calm, steady eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. He didn't need to boast about who he was. His actions spoke louder than words. Marcus wasn't in first class because of luck or privilege. He was there because he'd earned it, though he didn't expect anyone to care. The setting was simple but telling, a bustling airport leading to the confined space of a first-class cabin. The plane hummed with the usual mix of anxious travelers, business people glued to their laptops, and vacationers flipping through magazines. But amid the noise, one thing stood out. Victoria's disapproving glare the moment Marcus took the seat next to her. She didn't see the courage behind his quiet demeanor. She only saw someone she believed didn't belong. And that was her first mistake. The plane filled quickly, passengers hustling to stow their bags and find their seats. Victoria settled into her plush first-class chair, adjusting the silk scarf around her neck and glancing around with mild annoyance at the crowd. She sipped her sparkling water, scrolling through her phone, barely hiding her discontent when Marcus Johnson approached. Marcus moved with quiet confidence, his military uniform crisp but modest. He carried nothing more than a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. As he checked his seat number, he gave Victoria a polite nod before settling into the seat beside her. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She stared at Marcus, her gaze lingering a little too long. Then she sighed, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, and shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Excuse me," she muttered, her tone sharp and dripping with condescension. "I think you're in the wrong section. This is first class." Marcus turned slightly, his expression calm. "No, I'm in the right seat." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a tight, forced smile. "Oh, I just didn't expect... Well, never mind." She laughed softly under her breath, shaking her head as if Marcus's presence was some kind of joke. A few nearby passengers glanced over, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Marcus didn't respond. He simply faced forward, staring out the window unbothered. But Victoria wasn't done. As the flight attendant walked by, Victoria flagged her down. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her voice louder now, ensuring others could hear. "Is there any chance of changing seats? I was hoping for a more comfortable arrangement." The flight attendant blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This is your assigned seat." Victoria forced a tight smile. "Oh, I understand. It's just, I thought first class had certain standards." Marcus remained silent, his posture steady, his face unreadable. But the sting of her words lingered in the air. Throughout the flight, Victoria continued her passive-aggressive behavior. She exaggerated her discomfort, shifted dramatically in her seat, and even made snide remarks under her breath. "I just don't understand," she whispered to herself, pretending to scroll through her phone. "It's like they're letting anyone in here these days." Marcus never flinched. He didn't argue. He didn't engage. His silence spoke louder than any words could. At one point, the flight attendant brought them drinks. Marcus thanked her with genuine kindness, while Victoria barely acknowledged her presence. As the hours passed, Victoria's frustration grew, not because Marcus was doing anything wrong, but because he wasn't reacting. She thrived on superiority, and his calm demeanor was like a mirror reflecting her own insecurities. When the plane finally landed, Victoria grabbed her designer bag with a huff, eager to leave. She didn't offer Marcus a glance as she rushed off the plane, her pride intact. Or so she thought. But life has a way of teaching lessons when we least expect it. The next morning, Victoria sat in her luxurious apartment, sipping freshly brewed coffee, scrolling through the news on her tablet. She paused when a headline caught her eye. "Hero soldier saves dozens in overseas rescue mission." Curious, she clicked. The screen filled with images from a recent news report. Photos of a daring rescue operation, soldiers in action, and at the center of it all, the man she'd insulted just hours before. Marcus Johnson. The article detailed how Marcus had led a high-risk mission to save civilians trapped in a war zone. His bravery under fire had saved countless lives. He was being hailed as a national hero. Victoria's heart sank. She stared at the screen, her coffee forgotten, her hands trembling slightly. The weight of her arrogance crashed over her like a wave. The man she'd dismissed, insulted, and treated as less than, had more courage in his little finger than she'd ever known. She thought about his calm silence, the way he never reacted to her cruelty. It wasn't because he was indifferent. It was because he was stronger than her words. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from shame, but from the realization of who she had been. She had judged a hero without knowing his story. And now, it was too late to apologize. Victoria couldn't shake the image from her mind. Marcus Johnson's face stared back at her from the screen, surrounded by headlines praising his bravery. "Soldier leads heroic rescue mission. National hero returns home. Courage under fire, the story of Marcus Johnson." Her heart raced as she read the details. Marcus had risked his life to save innocent civilians during an ambush overseas. Despite overwhelming danger, he led his unit through enemy fire, carrying wounded comrades to safety. People hailed him as a hero. But to Victoria, he was the man she'd dismissed as unworthy of her respect. She sat motionless, her coffee cold, her thoughts tangled with regret. The memory of her own arrogance haunted her, the way she'd rolled her eyes, the sharp tone in her voice, the snide comments designed to belittle. She'd judged him based on nothing but the uniform he wore and the color of his skin. And now, she felt small. Days passed, but the weight of her guilt grew heavier. She saw Marcus's face everywhere, on TV interviews, news articles, even social media posts celebrating his heroism. The world applauded him, while Victoria carried the burden of knowing how she had treated him. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she decided to write a letter. She didn't expect a response. She wasn't looking for forgiveness. She just needed to say the words out loud, to admit the truth. The letter was simple. "Dear Mr. Johnson, I don't expect you to remember me, but I remember you. We sat next to each other on a plane not long ago. I was rude, dismissive, and disrespectful. At the time, I thought I was better than you because of where I was sitting, how I was dressed, and the life I thought I'd earned. I couldn't have been more wrong. The truth is, I was intimidated by your quiet strength, your calm confidence. I judged you without knowing a single thing about you. And now, after seeing your story, I realize that you embody everything I never had: courage, humility, and true honor. I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you. Not because the world now knows you as a hero, but because you were one even before the headlines. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive a woman who was blinded by her own ignorance. Sincerely, Victoria Langley. She mailed it, expecting nothing. Weeks passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. Or at least, it tried to. But Victoria wasn't the same. Every news clip about Marcus was a reminder of the lesson she'd learned the hard way. Respect isn't about status, wealth, or appearances. It's about character. Then, one day, an envelope arrived in her mailbox. No return address, just her name neatly written on the front. Inside was a simple note. "Dear Ms. Langley, I do remember you, but I don't carry resentment in my heart. Life is too short for that. What matters isn't how we treat people when we think they're important. It's how we treat them when we think they're not. I appreciate your letter. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. That's a kind of bravery, too. Wishing you peace and growth. Marcus Johnson." Victoria read the letter over and over, tears streaming down her face. Not because Marcus had forgiven her, but because he never needed to. He was always bigger than her ignorance. And in the quiet of her living room, surrounded by the emptiness of a life once filled with meaningless luxuries, Victoria learned the most valuable lesson of all. Victoria thought Marcus's letter would bring her closure. She expected the guilt to fade after reading his kind, forgiving words. But instead, the letter did something unexpected. It opened a door she didn't realize was there. Days after receiving it, Victoria found herself restless. The apology had been written, forgiveness had been granted, yet something inside her still felt incomplete. She realized it wasn't just about saying sorry, it was about understanding why she had been that person in the first place. Out of curiosity, or maybe something deeper, she began reading more about Marcus. She discovered not just stories of his bravery overseas, but articles about his work back home. Marcus wasn't just a soldier. He was a mentor, a volunteer, and an advocate for veterans struggling with PTSD. He had started a small foundation dedicated to helping soldiers transition back to civilian life, offering support where the system often failed. One article mentioned an upcoming event, a fundraiser to support his foundation. Without overthinking it, Victoria decided to attend. She told herself it was just to support a good cause, but deep down, she knew she wanted to see Marcus again. Not for his forgiveness, she'd already received that, but to face the person she'd judged so harshly. The event was simple, held in a modest community hall filled with people from all walks of life. No luxury decor, no red carpets, just heartfelt speeches, photographs of soldiers, and tables filled with handwritten thank you notes from families Marcus had helped. Victoria stood quietly in the back, feeling out of place among people whose lives had been touched by Marcus's kindness. She watched as he moved through the crowd, greeting people with genuine warmth, his smile reaching his eyes every time he spoke to someone. Eventually, their eyes met. For a brief moment, Victoria felt the familiar wave of shame rising inside her. But Marcus's expression wasn't cold or distant. It was the same calm, steady look he'd given her on the plane. Except this time, it was softer, almost like he recognized not just her face, but the effort it took for her to be there. Later that evening, as people began to leave, Victoria finally gathered the courage to approach him. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice quieter than she intended. Marcus turned, offering a polite nod. "Miss Langley." There was an awkward pause, but then Marcus gestured toward an empty chair nearby. They sat down, surrounded by the fading noise of the event. "I read about your foundation," Victoria said, trying to steady her nerves. "It's incredible what you've done." Marcus shrugged modestly. "I just try to help where I can." Victoria looked down, fidgeting with the clasp on her purse. "I thought your letter would be the end of it for me," she admitted. "But it wasn't. I realized I wasn't just apologizing to you. I was trying to make peace with the person I was." Marcus listened quietly, his presence steady and patient. She continued, "I spent so much of my life thinking I was better than people because of money, status, whatever, but the truth is, I was empty. And meeting you, realizing how wrong I was, it forced me to see that." Marcus smiled slightly, not out of pity, but with genuine understanding. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest battles aren't the ones fought overseas, they're the ones inside us." Victoria felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but this time, they weren't just tears of guilt, they were tears of clarity. "You didn't just forgive me," she whispered. "You taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Growth isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken lessons hanging gently between them. No anger, no resentment, just two people connected by a moment that had unexpectedly changed both their lives. As Victoria left the event that night, she felt something shift inside her. Not the relief of being forgiven, but the beginning of understanding what it truly meant to respect someone. Not because of what they do, but because of who they are. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Langley felt free, not from guilt, but from the ignorance that had once defined her. Victoria left the event that night with a feeling she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't relief, because forgiveness from Marcus had already been given. It wasn't guilt either, not anymore. It was something deeper, a sense of clarity she'd never felt before. For years, she had measured her worth by the weight of her wallet, the labels on her clothes, and the circles she moved in. But none of that had mattered to Marcus. He didn't care about the things she thought made her superior. What mattered was character, something she'd overlooked for far too long. Weeks passed, but Marcus's words lingered in her mind. The hardest battles aren't the ones fought overseas. They're the ones inside us. Victoria started to change, not in dramatic ways, but in the small, quiet moments where character is shaped. She volunteered at the same foundation Marcus had created, not for recognition or redemption, but because she genuinely wanted to give back. For the first time, she listened more than she spoke. She met veterans with stories that humbled her, people who had faced real struggles while she'd been insulated in a bubble of privilege. One day, as she was helping organize care packages for deployed soldiers, she found herself surrounded by people laughing, sharing stories, and working together with purpose. No one cared about her last name, her bank account, or the designer bag she used to flaunt. They cared about kindness, about showing up, about being present. And for once, Victoria didn't feel superior. She felt equal. And it was freeing. Months later, at another fundraiser event, Victoria was invited to speak. She stood at the front of a small crowd, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I used to think that respect was something people had to earn based on what they had," she began. "But I've learned that real respect comes from how we treat others, especially when we think no one's watching." She shared her story, not to paint herself as a victim of her own ignorance, but to show how one moment, one mistake, can change the course of your life if you're willing to learn from it. I met a man on a plane once, she continued, her voice softening. I judged him without knowing his name, his story, or his heart. I thought I was better than him because of where I sat, but the truth is, I was sitting in first class, and he was living with first-class character. The room was silent, not out of awkwardness, but because her words carried the weight of honesty. After the event, Marcus approached her with the same calm, kind smile. "You've come a long way," he said. Victoria smiled back, not with pride, but with gratitude. "Thanks to you." But Marcus shook his head slightly. "You did the work. I just sat next to you." They both laughed softly, a shared understanding between them. It wasn't about who they had been on that plane. It was about who they'd become since. Victoria's life continued, but with a new purpose. She didn't just live in luxury anymore, she lived with intention. She used her influence to support causes that mattered, not because it looked good, but because it felt good. She met people from all walks of life, and instead of judging them at first glance, she listened. Her story became a quiet reminder in her heart that the biggest lessons don't always come from books or classrooms. Sometimes they come from the person sitting right next to you on a plane. And as for Marcus, he continued his work, never seeking praise, never needing recognition. He didn't know how many lives he'd touched beyond the ones he saved overseas, but he had changed Victoria Langley's life. And that was enough. Sometimes the people we judge the quickest are the ones who leave the deepest mark on our hearts. Victoria thought she was just sharing a flight with a stranger, but that brief encounter changed the course of her life. It wasn't the luxury seats, the expensive handbag, or the title she carried that mattered. It was the lesson hidden in that quiet man's presence, a lesson about humility, respect, and the power of silent strength. Marcus never needed to defend himself. His actions, both on the battlefield and in life, spoke louder than words. And isn't that the truth? Real character doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, even in the face of ignorance. So here's a question for you. Have you ever misjudged someone, only to realize later how wrong you were? Maybe it was a stranger, a coworker, or even someone in your own family. What did you learn from that experience? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes it's not the big, dramatic moments that change us. It's the small ones, the ones we almost miss, that shape who we become. Thanks for watching. And remember, kindness doesn't cost a thing, but its value is priceless.